Christianity in the 11th century is marked primarily by the Great Schism of the Church, which formally divided the state church of the Roman Empire into eastern and western branches. In 1054, following the death of the Patriarch of Rome Leo IX, papal legates from Rome traveled to Constantinople to deny Michael Cerularius, the reigning Patriarch of Constantinople, the title of Ecumenical Patriarch and to insist that he recognized the Church of Rome's claim to be the head and mother of the churches. Cerularius refused, resulting in the leader of the contingent from Rome excommunicating Cerularius and the legates in turn being excommunicated by Constantinople. Though this event, in and of itself, was relatively insignificant, it ultimately marked the end of any pretense of a union between the eastern and western branches of the Church. Though efforts were made at reconciliation at various times, they remained divided, each claiming to be the true Christian Church. Investiture Controversy. The first major phase of the struggle between church and state in medieval Europe was marked by the Investiture Controversy between emperor and pope, over the right to make church appointments. The papacy were the initial victors, but as Italians divided between Guelphs and Ghibellines in factions that were often passed down through families or states until the end of the Middle Ages. The dispute gradually weakened the papacy, not least by drawing it into politics. In 1059 the Church attempted to control, or exact a price for, most marriages among the great by prohibiting marriages involving consanguinity and affinity to the seventh degree of relationship. Under these rules, almost all great marriages required a dispensation. The rules were relaxed to the fourth degree in 1215. The Investiture Controversy, or lay Investiture Controversy, was the most significant conflict between secular and religious powers in medieval Europe. It began as a dispute in the 11th century between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII concerning who would appoint bishops. The end of lay investiture threatened to undercut the power of the empire and the ambitions of noblemen for the benefit of church reform. Bishops collected revenues from estates attached to their bishopric. Noblemen who held lands hereditarily passed those lands on, within the family. However, because bishops had no legitimate children, when a bishop died it was the king's right to appoint a successor. So, while the king had little recourse in preventing noblemen from acquiring powerful domains via inheritance and dynastic marriages, a king could keep careful control of lands under the domain of his bishops. Kings would bestow bishoprics to members of noble families whose friendship he wished to secure. Furthermore, if a king left a bishopric vacant, then he collected the estate's revenues until a bishop was appointed, when in theory he was to repay the earnings. The infrequence of this repayment was an obvious source of dispute. The Church wanted to end this lay investiture because of the potential corruption, not only from vacancies but also from other practices such as simony. Pope Gregory VII issued the Dictatus Papare, which declared that the Pope alone could appoint or depose bishops or translate them to other sees. Henry IV's rejection of the decree led to his excommunication and a ducal revolt. Eventually Henry received absolution after dramatic public penance, barefoot in alpine snow and cloaked in a hair shirt. Though the revolt and conflict of investiture continued. Likewise, a similar controversy occurred in England between King Henry I and St. Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, over investiture and ecclesiastical revenues collected by the king during an episcopal vacancy. The English dispute was resolved by the Concordat of London in 1107, where the king renounced his claim to invest bishops but continued to require an oath of fealty from them upon their election. This was a partial model for the Concordat of Worms, which resolved the imperial investiture controversy with a compromise that allowed secular authorities some measure of control but granted the selection of bishops to their cathedral canons. As a symbol of a compromise, lay authorities invested bishops with their secular authority symbolized by the lance, and ecclesiastical authorities invested bishops with their spiritual authority symbolized by the ring and the staff. Theology. Western theology before scholasticism. With the division and decline of the Carolingian Empire, notable theological activity was preserved in some of the cathedral schools that had begun to rise to prominence under it, for instance at Auxerre, in the 9th century, or Chartres in the 11th. Intellectual influences from the Arabic world percolated into the Christian West via Spain, influencing such theologians as Gerbert of Aurillac, who went on to become Pope Sylvester II and mentor to Otto III. With hindsight, one might say that a new note was struck when a controversy about the meaning of the Eucharist blew up around Berengar of Tours in the 11th century. Hints of a new confidence in the intellectual investigation of the faith that perhaps foreshadowed the explosion of theological argument that was to take place in the 12th century. Notable authors include Fulbert of Chartres, Berengar of Tours, Lanfranc. Monasticism. One of the major developments in monasticism during the 11th century was the height of the Cluniac reforms, which centered upon Cluny Abbey in Burgundy, which controlled a large centralized order with over 200 monasteries throughout Western Christendom. Cluny championed a revived papacy during this century and encouraged stricter monastic discipline with a return to the principles of the Benedictine rule. Cluny Abbey promoted art and literature, and the liturgy at the Romanesque Abbey Church was an ornate formal affair dedicated to glorifying God. Together with the revived papacy, Cluny worked for greater devotion among men in the Church. Towards the end of the 20th century, the wealth and power of Cluny was criticized by many monastics in the Church, especially those that broke from the Cluniac order to form the Cistercians, who devoted themselves with much greater rigor to manual labor and severe austerity. Spread of Christianity. Poland. The spread Christianity was reversed temporarily in Poland, as the pagan reaction in Poland saw many churches and monasteries burned, and priests killed. Scandinavia. Scandinavia was the last part of Germanic Europe to convert and most resistant. From the High Middle Ages, the territories of Northern Europe were gradually converted to Christianity under German leadership and made into nation-states under the Church's guidance, finalized in the Northern Crusades. Later, German and Scandinavian noblemen extended their power to Finnic, Samic, Baltic and some Slavic peoples. Migrations of peoples, although not strictly part of the Migration Age, continued beyond 1000, marked by Viking, Magyar, Turkic and Mongol invasions, also had significant effects, especially in Eastern Europe. Goths. Many Goths converted to Christianity as individuals outside the Roman Empire. Most members of other tribes converted to Christianity when their respective tribes settled within the empire, and most Franks and Anglo-Saxons converted a few generations later. During the later centuries following the fall of Rome, as the Roman Church gradually split between the dioceses loyal to the Patriarch of Rome in the west and those loyal to the other patriarchs in the east, most of the Germanic peoples gradually became strongly allied with the Western Church, particularly as a result of the reign of Charlemagne. East-West Schism. The East-West Schism, or Great Schism, separated the Church into Western and Eastern branches, i.e., a Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. It was the first major division since certain groups in the East rejected the decrees of the Council of Chalcedon and was far more significant. Relations between East and West had long been embittered by political and ecclesiastical differences and theological disputes. There were doctrinal issues like the Filioque clause and the authority of the Pope involved in the split, but these were exacerbated by cultural and linguistic differences between Latins and Greeks. Prior to that, the eastern and western halves of the Church had frequently been in conflict. particularly during the periods of iconoclasm and the Phocian Schism. The Orthodox East perceived the papacy as taking on monarch-type characteristics that were not in line with the Church's historical tradition. The official schism in 1054 was the excommunication of Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople, followed by his excommunication of papal legates. Both groups are descended from the early Church. Both acknowledged the apostolic succession of each other's bishops and the validity of each other's sacraments, though both acknowledged the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. Eastern Orthodoxy understands this as a primacy of honor with limited or no ecclesiastical authority in other dioceses. The Orthodox East perceived the papacy as taking on monarch-type characteristics that were not in line with the Church's tradition. Ecclesiology. At the root of what became the Great Schism is the question of ecclesiology. The Eastern churches maintained the idea that every local city church with its bishop, presbyters, deacons and people celebrating the Eucharist constituted the whole church. In this view called Eucharistic ecclesiology, every bishop is St. Peter's successor in his church and the churches form what Eusebius called a common union of churches. This implied that all bishops were ontologically equal, although functionally particular bishops could be granted special privileges by other bishops and serve as metropolitans, archbishops or patriarchs. Early on, the ecclesiology of the Roman Church was universal in nature, with the idea that the Church was a worldwide organism with a divinely appointed center, the Church Bishop of Rome. Language and culture. The dominant language of the West was Latin, whilst that of the East was Greek. Soon after the fall of the Western Empire, the number of individuals who spoke both Latin and Greek began to dwindle, and communication between East and West grew much more difficult. With linguistic unity gone, cultural unity began to crumble as well. The two halves of the Church were naturally divided along similar lines. They developed different rites and had different approaches to religious doctrines. Papal supremacy. The primary causes of the schism were disputes over conflicting claims of jurisdiction, in particular over papal authority. Pope Leo IX claimed he held authority over the four Eastern patriarchs and over the insertion of the Filioque clause into the Nicene Creed by the Western Patriarch in 1014. Eastern Orthodoxy states that the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon explicitly proclaimed the equality of the bishops of Rome and Constantinople, and that it established the highest court of ecclesiastical appeal in Constantinople. The 7th canon of the Council of Ephesus declared, "It is unlawful for any man to bring forward, or to write, or to compose a different faith as a rival to that established by the Holy Fathers assembled with the Holy Ghost in Nicaea. But those who shall dare to compose a different faith, or to introduce or offer it to persons desiring to turn to the acknowledgement of the truth, whether from heathenism or from Judaism, or from any heresy whatsoever, shall be deposed. If they be bishops or clergymen, bishops from the episcopate and clergymen from the clergy, and if they be laymen, they shall be anathematized." Eastern Orthodoxy also observes that this canon of the Council of Ephesus in 431 explicitly prohibited modification of the Nicene Creed drawn up by the First Council of Nicaea in 325 and modified by the Second Ecumenical Council in 381. Thus to change "who proceeds from the Father" to "who proceeds from the Father and the Son" is rejected by the Orthodox both as illicit and doctrinally incorrect. In the Orthodox view, the Bishop of Rome would have universal primacy in a reunited Christendom, as primus inter pares without power of jurisdiction. Other points of conflict. Many other issues increased tensions. The Western Church's insertion of Filioque into the Latin version of the Nicene Creed, disputes in the Balkans, southern Italy, and Sicily over whether Rome or Constantinople had ecclesiastical jurisdiction. As a result of the Muslim conquest of the territories of the Patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch and Jerusalem, only two rival powerful centers of ecclesiastical authority, Constantinople and Rome, remained. certain liturgical practices in the West that the East believed represented illegitimate innovation. The use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist, for example, celibacy among Western priests, as opposed to the Eastern discipline whereby parish priests could be married men. Mutual excommunication of 1054. The dispute about the authority of Roman bishops reached a climax in 1054, when Michael I Cerularius tried to bolster his position as the Patriarch of Constantinople, seeming to set himself up as a rival of Pope Leo IX. As the popes previously had forbidden calling Constantinople a patriarchate. The dispute ended when the Pope's legate, Cardinal Humbert, excommunicated Cerularius and, in exchange, Michael excommunicated the papal legates. It was suspected by the Patriarch that the bull of excommunication, placed on the altar of Hagia Sophia, had been tampered with by Argyris, the commander of southern Italy, who had a drawn-out controversy with Michael I Cerularius. Although this is commonly viewed as the Great Schism, historically the event did little to change the relationship between East and West at that time. Michael himself knew that the Pope was a prisoner of the Normans at the time that Humbert arrived, and by the time Michael was excommunicated, Pope Leo had already died, voiding the papal legates of authority. Moreover, Michael did not excommunicate the Pope, nor even the Western Church, but only the papal delegation. It is probably more proper to point to the massacre of the Latins of 1182 or the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204 as more clear separation between the two churches. Most of the direct causes of the Great Schism, however, are far less grandiose than the famous Filioque. The relations between the papacy and the Byzantine court were good in the years leading up to 1054. The Emperor Constantine IX and the Pope Leo IX were allied through the mediation of the Lombard Catapan of Italy, Argyris, who had spent years in Constantinople, originally as a political prisoner. Cerularius ordered a letter to be written into the Bishop of Trani in which he attacked the Judaistic practices of the West, namely the use of unleavened bread. The letter was to be sent by John to all the bishops of the West, including the Pope. John promptly complied, and the letter was passed to Humbert of Montmoutiers, the Cardinal Bishop of Silva Candida, who translated the letter into Latin and brought it to the Pope, who ordered a reply to be made to each charge and a defense of papal supremacy to be laid out in a response. Michael was convinced to cool the debate and thus attempt to prevent the impending breach. However, Humbert and the Pope made no concessions, and the former was sent with legatine powers to the imperial capital to solve the questions raised once and for all. Humbert, Frederick of Lorraine, and Peter, Archbishop of Amalfi, arrived in April 1054 and were met with a hostile reception. They stormed out of the palace, leaving the papal response with Michael, who in turn was even more angered by their actions. The Patriarch refused to recognize their authority or, practically, their existence. When Pope Leo died on April 19, 1054, the legate's authority legally ceased, but they effectively ignored this technicality. In response to Michael's refusal to address the issues at hand, the legatine mission took the extreme measure of entering the Church of the Hagia Sophia during the Divine Liturgy and placing a bull of excommunication on the altar. The legates left for Rome 2 days after issuing the bull of excommunication, leaving behind a city near riot. The Patriarch had the immense support of the people against the Emperor, who had supported the legates to his own detriment. To assuage popular anger, the bull was burnt, and the legates were anathematized. Only the legates were anathematized, and once again, there was no explicit indication that the entire Western Church was being anathematized. In the bull of excommunication issued against Patriarch Michael by the papal legates, one of the reasons cited was the Eastern Church's deletion of the Filioque from the original Nicene Creed. In fact, it was the opposite. The Eastern Church did not delete anything. It was the Western Church that added this phrase to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Knighthood The nobility of the Middle Ages was a military class. In the early medieval period, a king attracted a band of loyal warriors and provided for them from his conquests. As the Middle Ages progressed, this system developed into a complex set of feudal ties and obligations. As Christianity had been accepted by barbarian nobility, the Church sought to prevent ecclesiastical land and clergymen, both of which came from the nobility, from embroilment in martial conflicts. By the early 11th century, clergymen and peasants were granted immunity from violence, the peace of God. Soon the warrior elite became sanctified. For example, fighting was banned on holy days, the truce of God. The concept of chivalry developed, emphasizing honor and loyalty amongst knights. With the advent of crusades, holy orders of knights were established who perceived themselves as called by God to defend Christendom against Muslim advances in Spain, Italy, and the Holy Land, and pagan strongholds in Eastern Europe. This activity brought considerable wealth and power. Wealthy lords and nobles would give the monasteries estates in exchange for the conduction of Mass for the soul of a deceased loved one, though this was likely not the original intent of Benedict. The efficiency of his cenobitic rule in addition to the stability of the monasteries made such estates very productive. The general monk was then raised to a level of nobility, for the serfs of the estate would tend to the labor, while the monk was free to study. The monasteries thus attracted many of the best people in society, and during this period the monasteries were the central storehouses and producers of knowledge.